Welcome to Chapter 2, Methods in Social Psychology. I hope the sound quality is okay. The computer was giving me feedback that the way I'm doing this is the best way, but I'm skeptical. We'll see how it goes. I'll be interested in hearing what you have to say. So, the first things we want to do is understand, what we're doing, what we're trying to do with social psychology research. In a lot of ways, we think of the world as a predictable place, but there are many situations that we encounter in everyday life where what we think should be happening is not what actually happens. We have surprises, we have pitfalls in our behavior and such. And social psychology does specific, carefully constructed research to try to understand and see what these situations could be so that we can understand better some of the foibles of human behavior. To do this, there's all kinds of ways to approach it, but believe it or not, some of the best ways to kind of get a sense on things is to do what's referred to as a thought experiment. Now, a thought experiment is nothing that you should be writing and publishing, but it is something that you can go through to think about, well, what should happen based upon the theories we know in psychology, basic principles and concepts and other findings. What do we think is likely to happen if this and that? How have I experienced it, and how in my discussions with other persons do they experience the errors they make and they notice, or the ways they do things well that they learn about? And so as we go through this, you should be doing thought experiments as you are considering some of the ideas talked about, because it will help you to develop your critical thinking skills. Now, when social psychologists and psychologists in general, in all all truth, go through their work, they go through some basic scientific ideas. This is from physical sciences as well. Is we create hypotheses that are based upon theories. Hypothesis is a prediction about what will happen in a particular circumstance based upon theory. We may have imagined what it should be from our thought experiment, and then we imagine how we can go through and create a substantial study to understand it. And then theories. Now, theories are things that we tend to, in everyday life, think of as kind of loose and flexible and almost meaning it's not true. But that's actually not the meaning that we intend when we're in our scientific world. The meaning is not, well, in theory that's what happens, but it's basically a way of saying, but that's not what really happens. Well, that's not how we think of it. A theory is a body of related propositions, that is, statements about how the world works, so that we say we have an understanding, and it is based upon a variety of observations, and a good theory explains these observations. And where you have relevant observations that don't fit the theory, you're in a position where you need to consider modifying the theory or coming in some ways so that you can encompass all of the relevant data as it has come in. There's also observational research. Observational research is the kind that we do when we're watching what's going on in the world. So we may have an hypothesis based upon a theory that suggests to us that we would expect persons to do their behavior in a different way if they see a mirror, for instance, in the room, which makes them more self-conscious, which tends to make a person behave more in concert with their ideals, their imagination of their ideal self. And so we might have a mirror set up in a place that you don't typically see one, but is not like totally weird, to see if people behave better because of the mirror that's in that location. This type of research is where we simply are observing the people there. We can set up a location where we can watch what's going on. That would allow us to do it. We take notes, we watch. We can even do this without setting up any kind of situation and just see how people behave doing things that they do in everyday life. All of this can lead us to have some sense of how we should set up a formal study about it, and then go about with other methods to create a more substantial study. These, because we know that whatever we see in our observations could be misleading. It could be bias in the eye of the beholder, or more likely we're looking at a unique group of people that may have unique ways of behaving. Another great way of doing research is what's referred to as archival research. That usually involves looking at a variety of behaviors that we see documented in some kinds of records in the past. Newspapers, police reports, hospital records, or all these kinds of things. Many years ago, we did a study where we went to, where myself and Jim Dabbs and Jasmine Riyad, we went to a prison in northern Georgia, and it was a very um, grievous place to be. It was sobering to go into a place like that. And in going there, we measured testosterone in prisoners. Well, we had the testosterone from them there, but we used archival research to do some of our examination of what's the implications are, what was connected to the testosterone levels we measured in the men that were in the prison. And we found that one of the most interesting relationships was between the thickness of their folder of misbehaviors while they're in prison was related to the to higher levels. That is, a thicker folder was higher levels of testosterone, and a lower levels of testosterone men had thinner folders. That means they had been involved in fewer ill behaviors while in prison compared to those with higher testosterone had a lot of ill behaviors in prison. And so we can look at all kinds of issues there, from homicides to the kinds of crimes that happen in certain parts of the country. There's even been the use of what we see in graveyards and gravestones to see if there's differences in how people are represented over time or depending upon social status and so forth. We can do surveys where we ask people about their opinions, their ideas, their thinking on things. Surveys are interesting to do, and they require a great deal of care to get useful data from. It's mainly an issue of sampling, which we'll talk about in a few moments. We have to be careful in interpreting because we know that people tend to respond, and their response rates could be indicating a problem that leads to a bias in our sample. Keep in mind that the word bias is being meant in its most generalized sense, as we're talking about right now, which means the results of the study are trending in a direction based upon some characteristic of the process that changes it from the true result in a systematic way towards a result that's not really representing the truth. So one of the ways we can avoid such biases is doing really good sampling. Good surveys are done with good sampling. And the best way to do good sampling is through a random sampling method where every person in the population we're trying to understand, which doesn't mean necessarily the entire world. It may not even necessarily mean the United States. It could be we're interested only in persons in Allegheny County. And as such, but whatever that method is, every person in that group has an equal chance of being studied. If you don't have that characteristic in your way of gathering persons, then you're doing effectively convenience sampling or some variation thereof, which means you can't be assured that you have all the varieties of people from both a cultural and background perspective, nor from a personality perspective, being represented in your study. There are a variety of different types of research, and they're broken into two broad categories. One of them is correlational research, and the other one is experimental research. Correlational research has some advantages. It's a type of research that does not involve us doing random assignment. That's different from random sampling. Random assignment to the different situations or conditions in the study. We simply are measuring some kind of object. Usually in psychology it's people, but there can be other things we look at to see if there is an association between two or more variables. That is the size of one variable correlated with the size of the other? As I described earlier, is the amount of testosterone correlated with the thickness of the folder? Now, we don't know for sure what the causal relationship could be there. It may be apparent, or we may imagine that it's higher testosterone causes a person to act worse. But it could very well be that a person that is finding themselves for personality reasons engaging in an awful lot of contentious situations is finding their testosterone is responding to that by going higher. And actually, that puts them in the situation of being more likely to also be in a lot of bad situations that ends up getting them in trouble. That is a third variable. Something about personality is causing them to be in situations which leads to higher testosterone. That would be a reverse causation, or even a third variable, something that causes both of those things to happen. All of these things are ways that make us fully understand that correlation is not any kind of statement of a causal relationship. It is simply indicating a connection is there. Now, the great advantage of correlational research is that we can get a sense of what's going on in the world. We can more easily get a hold of the data to know if there's something to look at sometimes, and then do a more substantial, possibly an experimental study. Correlational research allows us to do research where an experiment would be unethical or fundamentally impossible to conduct. There are certain things you simply should not ethically or morally do, or practically impossible to do. I cannot manipulate a person to be uh, male or female. I cannot manipulate a person to believe in one religion or another. It would be unethical for me to try to do those kinds of things. It would be immoral for me to try to do those things. So I have to accept that I'm limited by very appropriate norms of our culture to not do certain things. When we're talking about experimental research, we also we're thinking more in terms of gaining control over the material, what we're working with. We want to be able to separate out two conditions that we can then compare to each other, and we're going to use random assignment for the participants we get into our study. So all the persons who come into our study will be randomly placed in one of the two conditions, one of which is often a control condition, but not necessarily a control condition. It could be something that represents simply a good contrast, not something that is usually present, because there may not be something that really fits that. With all that said, we randomly assign people. And by doing that, any differences from person to person in background and personality get separated out. This enables researchers, therefore, to infer that whatever differences we see in the outcome of that study are due to the manipulation that was done in the first place to separate the people into groups. There's a presumption that many other factors that could be possibly different between the two conditions have been controlled to make sure they're essentially equal or actually equal, and the only real difference between the two groups is the specifics of the relevant manipulation. We can therefore establish that there's a causal relationship that can be supported, not casual, causal. Notice where you put the U really matters in the two words. Now, when we do an experiment, therefore, we have two variables that we're considering. There is the independent variable and the dependent variable. In experimental research, the independent variable is the one that we manipulate. It's the one that we make some kind of specific difference to create conditions in the study. And the dependent variable is the variable that is measured as an outcome. That is, after the manipulation, and that timing matters, there will be an outcome that occurs. And that outcome that occurs, we have a hypothesis of saying, if we do this manipulation, we're going to see this outcome happen. And then we measure to make sure that we have an objective way of seeing what that outcome is. One of the great things we love to be able to do is a natural experiment. This is when we can take advantage of a naturally occurring phenomenon, and we can, and even can sometimes create experiments in natural environments, but taking advantage of a naturally occurring event to be able to show that there is a difference to conditions. We've seen this kind of approach taken advantage of when there's been attempts to measure persons' feelings and attitudes about their community, about their lifestyle and life situation and such. And then in an area that is prone to having some kind of event happen, and then measure again after such an event has happened, such as a hurricane, measuring people along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, and then coming back and measuring those folks some years later after such an event has happened. And so that would be a natural experimental kind of situation. So we know that experiments can determine causation because the variables are controlled, and the manipulation limits. But manipulation issues may limit the validity of the results. Now, validity is our understanding of how true is this. We've done all this work. Is it really trustable? There's a couple of types of validity we're interested in. One of them is external validity. This is an indication of how well the results of a study generalize to contexts and people other than those that were in the study itself. Now, what we mean by that is maybe I have done a study about hurricanes. Would it apply to people who have been through situations associated with earthquakes? Well, I can't really know for sure about that, and therefore I can't know for sure if I have good external validity. I also don't know of how people that might respond in the American South would differ from persons in Latin America who suffer hurricanes or persons in Asia who suffer typhoons. And so these cultural differences means that we have an inherent limit in our external validity for that kind of study. That doesn't mean the study is worthless. It simply means we understand its limits. A field experiment is what I alluded to earlier, when you actually cause a manipulation in the world. There's been many studies of this kind done. Often they're helping studies that I'll talk about late in the semester, where we see how a person responds to seeing what appears to be an emergency in their everyday world. And you can create situations that have varying degrees of apparent emergency, change the characteristics of the person that the emergency appears to be happening with, and so forth. These would be called field experiments because they're done out in the natural world, and they're generally considered to have better external validity because no longer are you in the laboratory, as it's referred to sometimes, doing lab lore. Then we want to talk about internal validity. Now, internal validity is basically how good a job have you done with your random assignment, with making sure the conditions are equivalent, so that the only reasonable explanation for what you see in an outcome variable is the manipulation you did. And the best way to get control over all that kind of stuff is to go into what we refer to as the lab. Now, when we hear the word lab, we typically are thinking of something like a chemistry lab or a physics lab where you have the slate tables and all this kind of stuff. But in actuality, a laboratory is any room or dedicated space in which you're going to try to control conditions so that you can do work with the relevant materials for the concepts you're interested in. Internal and external validity may be oppositely related, with more than one type of validity can be controlled. That is, when you gain control to get internal validity, you often lose the ability to describe what's going on in the world. And you might imagine that if you try to do field experiments and you cause manipulations to have in the world, there can be a variety of intruding factors that you don't have any control of that could be affecting how a person responds to the manipulations you're creating. And involved in all of this is whether or not the tests and measurement methods that you use can be trusted. Are they reliable? Are they valid? Reliability is the degree to which any given measure that we use gives you repeatable, trustable numbers. That is, if I measure someone to have a high level of mental focus on math problems today, will I get a similarly high measure for their focus on math problems tomorrow? One would expect that a good measuring system should be able to see the same thing, and that we would expect it to be sensitive enough that if we create a distraction, that it would detect that the person's focus was less than it was on the on one measurement condition where there's not a distraction. This leads us to another concept of measurement validity, is that the correlation between what we're measuring and whether or not it's what we think it's measuring. The reliability is about whether or not we consistently get similar measures out of it. Well, validity is about whether or not we are measuring what we think we're measuring. That is, if I'm measuring something about a person's mental focus, how can I be sure it's actually mental focus that I'm measuring? This is acutely true when we start talking about controversial measures such as IQ. Is it really measuring something that we commonly assert to be something we call intelligence? There is plenty to debate on that. And personality tests are also things that, in general, are not highly predictive of behavior, particularly in specific situations. Because the more specific a situation is, the more the uniqueness of the situation guides behavior compared to general trends a person may exhibit across a variety of sometimes bit similar situations. Replication is always something that is greatly valued in science and has been interesting lately for psychology and the social sciences in general, and social psychology specifically. Replication refers to when a study has been done, can it be replicated, done again by other persons? Can they get a similar finding? And if a similar finding is not gotten by other persons, there's reasons to question whether or not the original study was well done or just luck. Accusations of incompetence or fraud are, you really have to have good evidence for those two things. Not to say it hadn't happened, because it does happen. There are people who out there who will commit fraud in their research, have done it, and have been caught. There are people that were shown to be incompetent in what they were doing. There was no evil intent. There was simply not well trained. And therefore they didn't really cross their T's and dot their I's in how they constructed their work, and what they found therefore was really not, it wasn't replicatable. There is also what we refer to as a replication crisis, as I was alluding to a few moments ago. This is what is going on in the social sciences in general, psychology somewhat, and social psychology specifically. And it's basically saying that a lot of studies that we've trusted for many years seem to not be replicating as much as we would expect them to be replicated. Therefore, what's the deal? Did we really find something years ago? Well, the answer to that question is intriguing, because we really are working through the data. What we're working through several well-funded efforts is to see, are we able to replicate these studies? And when we fail, do we understand why they failed? And when they succeed, are we clear that we actually did a good job, and therefore this is really a good replication? There's and same thing for a failure. Was it well done? And and if it failed because it wasn't done the same way as the original, well, then maybe that explains things, and let's do another replication. And so eventually we're validating some, but we're also finding some findings that have been highly celebrated, particularly some in recent years, are not being well supported over time. There's numerous what we refer to as priming studies. Now, priming in the cognitive psychology literature is well established and good. We tried to bring it over into some of the social psychology phenomenons, and while there are some priming effects in social psychology, they did not extend as widely as social psychologists began to apply them. such studies as simply reminding someone of a they need to be more careful about how they use certain vocabulary probably is not working as well as some studies tended to show. Of course, all research comes with ethical issues. I alluded to some ethical issues earlier about reasons that you can't necessarily do an experiment. You have to do sometimes correlational research. Every university, every research institution, doesn't have to be a university, has what's referred to as an institutional review board. Not related to this course because we don't do much animal research in social psychology, though a little bit is done. Or animal use boards, which do the same ethical examination when animals are involved in studies. Institutional review boards examine whether or not we're taking care with our participants, we're not mistreating them, and that is it appropriate. There's been some controversy over the years about whether or not IRBs are doing their job as well as they should be. I think largely they have, but there has been a marked increase in care being taken by IRBs, and there's been some shifts in the thinking of what our IRBs should look at. Historically, IRBs didn't really care much about whether or not the study was well-founded research, that is, a good idea based upon theory. Increasingly, though, universities' IRBs are looking at, is this actually a reasonable study to do? Or is this just kind of someone's raving imagination and really shouldn't be done? That is, if you're going to spend someone's time and you're going to bother them with doing the study, you want to bother them with a study that actually is reasonably got a chance of finding something. You don't want to have people waste their time and all these other things if it's a poor quality study. Frostburg State has an IRB and has an animal use board as well. Informed consent is a critical characteristic of all research in psychology. That is, the person is agreeing that they're going to participate. They're informed about what's going to happen in the study, about anything that's relevant to a decision to stay in the study or leave it. And they're also informed that they can leave at any time if they become uncomfortable or wish to leave, and they will be, and whatever compensation is being offered will be at the very least proportionate to the time they spent, if not a full amount of money, or usually it's money given to them. In social psychology research, we have some unique things we do. Other areas of psychology do some of this, but social psychology is just filled with the use of deception in research. When you're talking about trying to research persons' behaviors with respect to other persons, you've got to create situations where they're not informed ahead of time of the social interaction they're getting ready to have that you're measuring them on. Otherwise, you're not going to get a natural response at any reasonable level. So it is known that you can use deception in such cases as long as it's not something that would lead someone to not participate in the study, and it's the minimal amount of deception necessary for the study to be done and actually have a chance of showing what it's intended to be shown. Also, you have to include what is called a debriefing. Now, this is done pretty much after any experiment, and it's largely because a lot of people worry that they were deceived, and so what you want to do is say, folks, no, this study was exactly what we told you it was. In psychology, we have to tell people this is what was actually going on, and we apologize. And if you don't want us to use your data, we're happy to pull it and not have your data be used, but we hope you'll let us use it. And otherwise, just help them understand what was actually done. Most people have a very good humor about it. They understand. They've all watched TV shows like Candid Camera and the YouTube versions of similar things. by persons such as Mr. Beast and so on. So they're quite aware of the fact that people will engage in deceptions to see how people react to it, and that's all great. Uh, but still, we treat it very seriously because whenever you are lying to people, you become dangerously close to some of the most reprehensible studies in the history uh, of scientific research with human subjects, such as the horrors of the Tuskegee experiment, among many others. There are a couple of different classifications that we also like to make sure students are aware of. One of them is basic research. This is trying to understand a phenomenon as a phenomenon. It's basically establishing that theories are as we think they are. Build a theory about how the world works, and then after you've got that, you might start looking then at applied research. That is trying to take what we've learned from our theoretical research and turn it our basic research and turn it into solving an actual problem in the world. If you've got persons, for instance, right now saying they're not interested in getting vaccinations, they are being misinformed by a lot of people about it and think that vaccinations are bad, evil, dangerous, and numerous other things. It's it's how do you combat that effectively? And psychological research can help to create, to apply theories that we know of to devise methods of informing people accurately and breaking through some of the misinformation that's out there. These tools can be used to do the opposite, though, as you might imagine, which is what a lot of the misinformation is based on, using the tools of social psychology, psychology in general, to convince people to not get vaccinated and not wear masks and other things that are saving people's lives. And then it can also be an intervention that might have an effect upon individuals as opposed to groups of individuals. These are the things that I wanted to make sure I focused on out of Chapter 2. I hope that you found this informative. I apologize for being a whole blocks of text all the way through. I will see you later. Thank you so much for your attention. Bye bye.